I'm really glad that we're able to continue in this conversation about the duality of leadership. And I hope that your experience with your small group or in your personal time of reflection was really helpful last time in designing and reflecting on the shape of your iceberg. If you haven't been able to do that, I urge you to do that. It is fundamental to an understanding of who you are as a leader and understanding this concept of the duality of leadership in terms of how God has made you. So please take time with that if you haven't already. Built upon that foundation of the duality of leadership as represented in the scriptural anchoring in 1 Peter 2:9 and in the metaphor of the iceberg that I shared with you last time, I'd like to pick up and move it forward just a little bit in understanding what I call this idea of the trap of performance-based identity. And this one is a rather sober topic and session because it has to do with the potential, well, not just the potential, but the reality of failure in leadership and where that often comes from. Because we often assume that failure in leaders, especially high-profile leaders, whether they are senior executive leaders in corporations, or whether they are educational leaders, or whether they are pastors of churches, failure in leadership most often is a result of a lack of understanding this idea of the duality of leadership and the importance of what I talked with you last time being the bottom of the iceberg. So I want to get into that a little bit with you here today. So I hope that in a grace-filled exchange of thinking together, we can begin to edge in on some of the principles that I think God really wants us to embrace as leaders in becoming effective in fulfilling our vocational calling. So the trap of performance-based identity. You know that in this iceberg metaphor, 90% of the iceberg is above, 10% of the iceberg is above the waterline and 90% is beneath the waterline. Now, as you know, the top of the iceberg is the visible part of who you are as a person. The bottom is really unseen by other people. And you also know that it is from the top of the iceberg that we have our interfacing, our interaction in leadership, in our jobs, in our functions, in our relationships. And you also know that at the top of the iceberg is where all leadership assessment really focuses. How well do you do your job? How timely are you? Is it being done with effectiveness? Is it being done in alignment with the mission and the values of the organization? And so you are assessed at the top of the iceberg. It's also, because it is the only part of the iceberg that is seen, it also becomes the target of people who want to criticize you. So when people are throwing insults at you, or perhaps they are criticizing your behavior or your performance on the job, it's the top of the iceberg that they're looking at. And when people attack you, they will attack the top of the iceberg. Imagine if there is a ship sailing in the North Atlantic, right? And it's got a group of people on it who, I don't know, they are carrying long rifles and they haven't done target practice in a while. I have no idea why that would be the case, but for purposes of example, let's just go with me here, okay? You got a group of people with rifles, and they decide one day as they're crossing the North Atlantic that they want to take some target practice. And they happen to see an iceberg out in the distance, and so they decide, let's shoot our guns and do target practice. Well, what part of the iceberg do you think they're going to shoot? Clearly, it's not the bottom of the iceberg because they can't see it and there's nothing to aim at. It's the top of the iceberg they're going to shoot at. It's the top of the iceberg that they're going to target. It's the top of the iceberg that's going to get the hits from those bullets, and it's going to send chips out of the top of the iceberg. It's going to sting. It's going to hurt, you see. but the bottom of the iceberg remains unseen and untouched. Imagine for a minute that an iceberg is floating on the North Atlantic, and all of a sudden a hurricane comes. I don't really think that there are hurricanes in the North Atlantic, but again, go with me for purposes of illustration here. There's a giant storm on the North Atlantic, and the waves start getting huge waves, and the lightning starts coming, and the sleet starts hitting the top of this iceberg. Well, that's going to try to rock the iceberg, but it's not going to hurt the bottom of the iceberg. You see, when you are attacked, when you are criticized, when you're going through a rough time on the job, when you get the pink slip of dismissal, when groups are plotting against you for a particular direction in strategy or tactics or projects that you're working on, it's going to be the top of the iceberg that they target. And that's why it's so important that the bottom of the iceberg remain secure. In this iceberg that's shaped like this, if I were to ask you, where is the center of gravity for this iceberg? Well, the center of mass or gravity. Now, please understand, I am not an expert in geometry or physics or any of the other hard sciences that have to do with centers of gravity, center of mass, and all of that. You may be. So you can feel free to email me and correct me if you'd like, but I think I'm generally right when I say that the center of gravity for this iceberg is down here in the lower part of this iceberg. I think the geometry of it, as I'm told, is that in an isosceles triangle, the center of gravity is 1/3 up from the bottom of the base of the triangle. So it's generally the center of gravity for an iceberg like this is going to be low in the water. Now, if we go back to that story of a big storm on the North Atlantic that's hitting the top of the iceberg, and it's taking chips out of the top of the iceberg, either because of a storm of circumstance that you're going through as a leader, or because people are criticizing you and doing target practice on your life and your activities, trying to attack you, it's all focused on the top of the iceberg. The storm is severe at the top. And you've been through some pretty severe storms as a leader. I have been through some pretty severe storms as a leader. But when you drop down 200 or 300 feet beneath the waterline to the center of gravity, what's the condition at that level? It may be stormy up here, but down here, it's calm, it's quiet, it's peaceful, and it's stable. Now remember, the thing that sustains the top of the iceberg and holds it solid is the bottom of the iceberg. What keeps you steady in the storms of your circumstance are not your cleverness or ability to engage transactionally and be smarter than the people that are criticizing you. The thing that holds you stable is not your activity or your capacity for good performance. The thing that holds you stable is a well-formed bottom of the iceberg with a low center of gravity where it is peaceful, it is calm, and it is stable. Now, does that mean that the storms on the top of the water are not going to hurt? No, of course not. Does that mean that you're not going to feel the sting of criticism? Of course you are. But it's not going to cause your life to capsize. It's not going to cause you to curl up in the fetal position and get under your desk and suck your thumb. Your identity is strong, and the bottom of your iceberg is going to hold you stable and keep you from being blown around by every wind that comes along, you see. So this center of gravity is a really important feature. And in a well-formed iceberg, it is low because the iceberg is stable. Now, imagine, and here I'm going to step across the limits of of physical science, so those of you who are icebergologists or those of you who are scientists, I know that I'm going across reality here. But for purposes of illustration, I hope you give me some grace. Imagine for a moment that I could change the shape of the iceberg. Remember, this one is 10% above and 90% below. And generally, I think that's the principle. There's always 10% above and always 90% below. Even the ice cube that floats in your iced tea, right? Imagine, though, that I could change the law of physics and I could change the shape of this iceberg and I made it a square. Now, where's the center of gravity for that iceberg? Well, it's not down here. It's actually right here in the middle of that square. So now, instead of 80 or 100 mile an hour winds being able to be hitting this iceberg with a low center of gravity and it remaining solid, maybe 30 or 40 mile an hour winds hit this iceberg and it starts to roll in the water. It's not nearly as stable with a higher center of gravity than this well-formed iceberg with a low center of gravity. I think you understand the principle here. Now, if I further could change the shape, once again, not from this one, and not even a square with a higher center of gravity, but imagine, and I know this is impossible, but imagine with me here on this metaphor, because it I think drives the point home. Imagine if I could invert this iceberg so that 10% of it were beneath the waterline and 90% were above the waterline. Again, you think that's crazy, and I understand. But just imagine it in your mind's eye. Where is the center of gravity of this third inverted iceberg? Well, again, it's 1/3 from the base of the triangle. The center of gravity is way up here. Now, this iceberg with a low center of gravity is really stable, and it can withstand a lot of storms and a lot of criticism. It'll hurt, but it can withstand it and remain stable. This square iceberg with a center of gravity right at the waterline may not be able to withstand as much before it starts toppling over and rolling in the water, if that's even possible. This high center of gravity, the iceberg with a high center of gravity that's inverted, is going to be very precarious, very unstable, very susceptible to the wind up on the top of the water. And maybe a little 5 mile an hour wind and a little 6-inch wave is going to cause this iceberg to crash and come toppling over in the water. Now, I think you see the point. A well-formed leader who understands that their identity is what holds them stable in the midst of circumstances that may be stormy, will have a low center of gravity. You see, you remain stable in criticism and stormy circumstance, not because you are capable of transactionally handling things, but because you have a low center of gravity. You have a clear sense of identity that is beneath the waterline in the secret places of who you are. Now, in my experience as a leader, as an overseer of leaders, often in crisis, I have found that in almost every case of failure in leadership that is traumatic, public, and of a crisis level, it is a result of the fact that there is a high center of gravity where the leader has focused more on what they do than who they are. This is a condition that I call performance-based identity. And performance-based identity is when you are answering bottom of the iceberg questions with top of the iceberg answers. In other words, somebody asks you, "Who are you?" And you say, "I'm a truck driver." "Who are you?" "I am a computer specialist." "Who are you?" "I am a elementary school teacher." "Who are you?" I am a pastor. Who are you? I am a CEO. You see, you're answering a bottom of the iceberg question, who are you, with a top of the iceberg answer, what you do. Who you are is much more than what you do. Performance-based identity is when you start thinking of yourself as merely what you do. When you start telling people that your job or your function or your performance is synonymous with your character, your nature, and your identity. When you conflate your identity with your job, you are going to fall prey to performance-based identity. And when you start defining who you are by what you do, suddenly, when what you do doesn't go so well, you start thinking you're a bad person. You start questioning the very core of your existence. You start wondering if you even matter. You start questioning your value. You start wondering if the world would be better if you were not here. You start thinking, if I could just leave this earth, then my family would be better. My work would be better. You start assuming that the definition of who you are in the bottom of your iceberg is merely the sum total of your performance, task, and activity. That's a trap, folks, because with a high center of gravity, it won't take much criticism before you capsize, you fall. That's where burnout comes from. That's where moral failure in leadership comes from. That's often where many self-selected choices to disqualify yourself come from. That's where all kinds of inner turmoil comes from, when you start thinking of yourself only in terms of what you do. That's performance-based identity. And if I can say, if you can hear nothing more from me in this series than this, please don't fall prey to performance-based identity. Please take care of the bottom of your iceberg. Please invest, and we'll talk about that in the next session, how to tend the bottom of your iceberg. Now, as I describe this to you with these various different centers of gravity, one that is low, one that is at the waterline, and one that is high, clearly, I want to call you to a condition of a well-formed iceberg with a low center of gravity. Performance-based identity doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen where one day you wake up and say, oh, today I think I'm going to focus my identity on my performance, and I'm gonna invert my iceberg. No. This happens over a series of months or years or even decades. And it doesn't happen usually by intention. It happens by neglect and ignorance. Let me show you how that works. In this well-formed iceberg, when you start neglecting the bottom of your iceberg, it will start to dissolve. It will start to go away. And as the bottom of your iceberg shrinks, what happens to the center of gravity? It starts to move up and up and up until you find yourself more defined by what you do than who you truly are. And then a crisis hits and a crash occurs. This happens over neglect. When you neglect the bottom of your iceberg, the shape of your iceberg will change and the center of gravity will move up. Now, I could tell you an awful lot of stories about leaders who have fallen prey to performance-based identity, and they are not pretty. During a previous series of my life, in overseeing leaders, every 6 months I was having to remove another leader from leadership roles because of a failure in that leadership, most often a moral failure. And the pain that that caused for families and churches and individuals and friends, to say nothing of the resources that were spent trying to redeem that, to say nothing of my own thought, very deep turmoil in my life, very dark nights trying to figure out what's going on here, and trying to address the issues of performance and realizing it's like putting a Band-Aid on a surgical wound. It doesn't work. And it wasn't until I began to call my team to a deeper level of tending the well of their identity, of building and forging and forming the bottom of their iceberg in identity. When we began to do that, suddenly, those failures in leadership began to abate, taper off, less and less. I began to realize that one of the biggest contributors to failure in leadership is not having, not forming, not paying attention to the development and formation of who you are in your identity, your character, your nature. So please, above all else, go to the seminars that tell you how to do stuff and tell you how to make decisions and how to engage and how to put structures in place and how to plan succession and all of the, go to those seminars. They're okay, top of the iceberg. But for me and my call to you, my desire for you is that you will invest in the bottom of your iceberg to maintain a low center of gravity. That is what is going to withstand any storm, any criticism. That is what's going to sustain you as an increasingly effective leader in engaging with people around you. Please take care of the bottom of your iceberg. We'll talk about that in the next session. But for now, take a few minutes of reflection, get with your small group, talk with your co-laborers, and discuss perhaps some of the pressures that you observe that will try to focus your attention on the top of the iceberg instead of the bottom. Talk about those pressures and see if you can identify those. Not that they're bad, but talk about those so that you've named them. And I'll look forward to joining you in our next session. God bless you.